The recent fighting last month between the State of Israel and Hamas in Gaza was terrible for both sides, with Hamas largely using rockets against Israel and Israel using mainly planes to bomb Hamas in Gaza. Was horrendous for both sides in terms of casualties and the wider conflict between these two in Palestine as a whole. This is incredibly complicated, so I shall try my best to explain it for you. Many people believe the tensions and the war's context goes back for centuries due to the various religious differences between the two sides, and although religion is heavily involved, it's much more about where these religious sites are and which land do these sites belong to, the predominantly Muslim Arabs or the mostly Jewish Israelis. But to understand the conflict fully, we need to look at the two different perspectives. For the Arabs, we need to go back to around 1908, when the Young Turks led a revolution against the Sultan, the absolute authoritarian monarchy of the Ottoman Empire. Previously, the Sultan ruled with absolute power. He was answerable to no one. Now, the Young Turks changed this, making him a constitutional monarch, a ceremonial role with little power. This new movement decided to reform the declining Ottoman Empire and sought foreign help from countries such as Germany. It removed the autonomy of the various Arab peoples, making them disillusioned with the Ottomans. The various Arab peoples began to see themselves as not just Arab, but Saudi, Jordanian, Iraqi, and so on. Meanwhile, in Europe around the 1880s, Jewish intellectuals began to write about possibly returning to this area, what they considered the Holy Land. This was said to be the area where ancient Israel was thousands of years ago, with its capital city of Jerusalem, but disappeared after the Romans invaded and sacked the city in the year 70 AD. They felt that if they returned to this land, they would no longer face the discrimination and anti-Semitism that was alleged to be occurring back then. This movement would later become to be known as Zionism. Then World War I rocked the world. Starting in 1914, the conflict initially thought to be a very short conflict soon bogged down into trench warfare and dragged on for far longer than anticipated. In October of 1914, the Ottomans entered the conflict on Germany's side. Now, the Ottomans back then, with its declining empire, were seen as weak, as not as strong as its German enemy, and soon the British saw an opportunity and took advantage of this disillusioned bunch of Arabs in the Middle East who saw the Ottomans now as oppressive for removing their autonomy. The British were very liberal when it came to their promises back then, declaring their support for the Arabs to have vast amounts of land. In exchange, the Arabs would launch revolts against their Ottoman overlords. This worked and the Arabs revolted. Meanwhile, the British felt that they needed even more support for the war and turned to the Jews, issuing the Balfour Declaration declaring Britain's support for a Jewish homeland in Palestine. But the Arabs were unaware of this deal and were promised also by the Brits that what they saw as their land, that it would be given to them after the war to the Arabs and not to be shared with anyone else. In October of 1918, the Ottomans surrendered, and a month later, World War I ended and the British, along with their French allies, began carving up the Middle East. You see, also during the war, the British went behind their backs, signing agreements with the French and the Russians over spheres of influence and taking control of key areas. All of these overlapped with the declarations of land for the Jews and Arabs. And with the World War over, these agreements were put into action, angering both the Jews and the Arabs. However, in the years after the conflict, more and more Jews were returning to their perceived homeland. With the rise of the Nazis in Germany, the country was becoming increasingly hostile to its Jewish citizens. Meanwhile, the various Arab countries were forming: Transjordan, Iraq, Lebanon, Syria, with the previous two under British administration, and Syria and Lebanon under the French administration. However, as the Arabs in Palestine began to see more and more Jews in what was perceived as their land, they began to commit attacks against not only the Jews, but against the British, as they badly wanted independence. And now, this caused the British to begin setting limits for Jewish immigration. Then the Holocaust occurred, along with World War II, and even more Jews in devastated European countries wanted to build their own country their style. Meanwhile, the Jews already in Palestine began to launch their own attacks on the Arabs and British. With World War II over, the British finally began to withdraw, and the 15th of May 1948 would be chosen as the first day the British would no longer govern the area. They turned to the newly formed United Nations to form a plan to divide up the region between the Jews and Arabs so that everyone could be happy. They produced this plan, giving the Jews this area and the Arabs this area. Jews endorsed the plan and declared independence as the State of Israel, whilst the Arabs in Palestine and the surrounding Arab countries rejected the plan, seeing it as Western imperialism, and invaded the one-day country. After heavy fighting, Israel won the war and it took new territory, whilst Gaza was occupied by Egypt and Jordan occupied the West Bank. And then an uneasy truce occurred between Arabs and Jews. In 1967, another war began, which was creatively named the Six-Day War. After heavy fighting, Israel won the war, capturing the Golan Heights from Syria, the Gaza Strip from Egypt, along with the Sinai Peninsula and the West Bank from Jordan. With this victory, Israel now had to govern all of the Palestinian territory that was originally set out for them. Meanwhile, the defeated Arab countries began to think about retaking their lost territory, and most Arab nations decided to meet in Sudan's capital to adopt the free nose policy. No peace with Israel, no recognition of Israel, no negotiations with Israel. Two countries decided to fight Israel again, Syria and Egypt. Their plan was to launch a surprise attack on Israel on the Jewish holy holiday Yom Kippur, a widely observed day of fasting, rest and prayer in Judaism, and during the Muslim fasting of Ramadan. After initial gains, the Israelis launched counterattacks, regaining what it lost with Syria, plus more, reaching just 20 miles from Damascus, the Syrian capital. On the Egyptian front, the Israelis advanced even deeper into Egypt, but failed to dislodge the Egyptian forces on the northern and southern part of the Sinai Peninsula, which the Egyptians had captured, causing the Third Army to get flanked, and so Egypt and Syria agreed to a United Nations ceasefire. This changed the wider Arab-Israeli conflict a lot, as now war was largely taken off the table as Arab countries failed to defeat Israel. Instead, a cold peace would set in. However, one country decided to make peace, Egypt. In exchange for peace and recognition of Israel, Israel would have to cede the entire Sinai Peninsula back to Egypt. This was incredibly controversial, and this was the main reason as to why the president of Egypt, Anwar Sadat, was assassinated by radical Islamists opposed to this peace treaty. Meanwhile, starting in the late 1960s, Israelis were moving into the West Bank and Gaza. Many saw it as their land, as the previous two Jewish kingdoms allegedly ruled roughly over it. Others saw it as land set for them by God, and this thinking was reinforced by the recent victories over the Arab armies. While most just like the fact that housing is cheap and care little about the conflict, all of these types of Israelis came to be known as settlers, which were and still are considered illegal under UN law. As settlers moved into the West Bank and Gaza, a new group known as the PLO, the Palestine Liberation Organization, forms, which seeks to remove all these Israelis from the West Bank, Gaza and all of Israel, using violence as its main method. Now in 1982, Israel invades neighbouring southern Lebanon, allegedly because it wanted to dislodge the PLO from the country. This worked and the PLO relocated to Tunis, Tunisia. A few years later, the occupied Palestinians became increasingly angry at the occupation, so they decided to launch an uprising, known as the First Intifada. This violent uprising against the Israelis lasted for 5 years. During the fighting, a new group that had emerged from the Muslim Brotherhood, another radical Islamic organisation, began to form. It began to attack Israeli civilians as well as military personnel, which largely didn't happen too much up until this point. This organisation became known as Hamas, and it sought Israel's complete destruction. According to the group, the West Bank and Gaza wasn't occupied land, it was all of Israel as well. All this horrendous violence was one of the main causes why the Israelis and Palestinians would finally sit down in Madrid, Spain for peace talks. However, these talks failed, and so the US stepped in 2 years later hoping for a breakthrough. This time, the talks would be led by the US under President Bill Clinton, who would bring together the Israelis and Palestinians to go to Oslo in Norway and sign the Oslo Accords. This resulted in a breakthrough establishing free areas in the West Bank, giving Palestinians at least some level of self-rule/autonomy, but still far away from most Palestinians' goal of complete independence. Now, hardline Palestinians and Israelis oppose this agreement, with the Israeli right calling the Israeli Prime Minister a traitor for helping their enemy get closer to their goal of independence, and the hardline Palestinians because they saw the deal as giving way too little to them. Meanwhile, Hamas launches suicide attacks in an attempt to stop the process. After the Accords, the Prime Minister of Israel would be assassinated by an ultra-nationalist Israeli. Although both sides continued to talk, they soon stalled, and by 2000, the peace process broke down again, angering Palestinians so much that they decided to launch another intifada. This second intifada lasted for 5 years and was far more violent than the first. To calm the situation down, Israel withdraws its military forces along with the civilian settlements from Gaza in 2005. The next year, Hamas takes power in the Strip in elections, and due to ongoing disagreements with the main, more moderate political party of Fatah, splits with them, and after a short 5-day conflict, expels the last few Fatah troops from Gaza, only leaving Hamas there. A year later, the group begins using mortars and rockets to attack the Israeli city of Ashkelon. After Israel carries out a raid on Gaza, killing a few more of Hamas's members, Hamas launches even more rocket attacks, this time further away into southern Israel, causing Israel to launch a full-scale invasion of Gaza, taking key territory in Gaza before withdrawing. After failed peace talks from 2012 to 2013, both Hamas and Israel accused each other of violating the ceasefire, and another war that lasted for 7 weeks occurred in 2014, with Hamas launching rocket attacks on Israel, killing many Israelis, and Israel launching bombing raids on Gaza, killing way more Gazian civilians as well as Hamas militants. After years more of failed talks and growing tensions, in 2020, President Trump unveiled his peace plan, giving Israel vastly more territory, making most of its various settlements in the West Bank as legal as it would become Israeli soil. In exchange, they would give small amounts of territory elsewhere to the Palestinians. This would be rejected by the Palestinians strongly though. Now we need to know what happened in 2021. Basically, back in April of 2021, Israeli forces pushed into the Haram al-Sharif, or the Temple Mount, pushing Muslim mosque attendants and stopping a Muslim religious ceremony so that the Israeli president Reuven Rivlin could deliver a speech undisturbed at the Western Wall below to commemorate Memorial Day, a national holiday in Israel. Because of this, it was a sensitive time for Jews, but it was also a sensitive time for Muslims as well due to Ramadan, and this site is seen as holy for both religions. Enraged at the Israelis for occupying this holy site for Muslims, Hamas gave the Israelis an ultimatum, giving them until the 10th of May 6 PM Jerusalem time to withdraw from the Haram al-Sharif mosque site and the Jara, which is a predominantly Palestinian neighbourhood of East Jerusalem, where Israeli citizens have been apparently taking property from Palestinians, or Israel would face more rocket attacks from them. Israel chose to ignore this deadline, so Hamas launched their rocket attacks, causing Israel to use its missile defence system and to bomb key areas of Gaza. Israel claims that it is targeting Hamas troops in the strip of land, but many of its bombs have landed sadly in civilian areas, as Israel claims that Hamas had used civilians as human shields, an accusation of which it denies, despite being condemned by the EU for allegedly doing this back in 2014, in the war that happened then. So in a nutshell, that's the conflict. Incredibly complex and insanely hard to solve. However, luckily, just recently on the 20th of May 2021, violence stopped with a ceasefire between the two sides, which was brokered by Egypt, which took effect the next day. However, it is very fragile, and so a return to violence is very likely to happen in the future. Let's hope that this doesn't happen. Now obviously this video is very oversimplified, and I couldn't mention the other countries that are involved heavily, such as the US, Iran, Syria and Lebanon, or even the different peoples of these sides of the conflict. So for example, in America, with the Democrats primarily being pro-Palestine and the Republicans being mainly pro-Israel. But if you have anything you think I should have mentioned, please add what I should have added in the comment section down below. I'm just hoping it can stay as civil as it possibly can be when a person talks about Palestine/Israel. In the meantime, please feel free to suggest any other video you think I should do. I have a few more I'm working on, and as always, thank you for watching this video.